Today on Speak Life, I am with Marcus Honeysett. He is the director of Living Leadership and the author of many books, including Powerful Leaders. Thanks so much for joining us, Marcus.
It's nice to be here, Glenn.
Now, I mentioned Living Leadership. That's a real passion of yours. Can you explain what that is and why it exists?
So Living Leadership is a ministry that disciples and trains church leaders. We are passionate about spiritually healthy leaders for spiritually healthy churches. We've been going since 2005, originally started with a number of churches being interested together in discipling leaders every stage through church life. And the thing we're probably best known for is a thing called the Pastoral Refreshment Conference, which is soul care for leaders and spouses in local churches, and that seems to have really hit a nerve.
Yeah, why do you think that is? The pastoral refreshment of pastors. So this is a conference that leaders go away to, and it's not simply to gain tools in their own sort of leadership, but what do they go to the pastoral refreshment to?
Yes, it's not about leadership tools or competencies at all. It's just about their walks with the Lord and their spouses' walks with the Lord as well. If you ask anybody in a local congregation, do you know who feeds the people who feed you? You will find the answer very often is no, we have no idea. And in too many cases, that means that the people who feed other people are the least fed in the church themselves. And that's obviously a recipe for disaster. If you're trying to give out of depletion and emptiness, then you can do that for about 15 years, perhaps before it all crumbles, but then it crumbles for an awful lot of people. So three of us were once at a conference having lunch and asking why member care or soul care was normal in missions movements, but not in the pastoral movements that we were part of. We wrote on the back of a napkin what we most wanted for the care of our own souls, what would keep us walking in God's grace, what would encourage us, what opportunity we'd love to get prayed for and have pastoral input that was particularly tailored to our needs in ministry. And we actually wrote it on the back of a napkin that I wish I'd kept. And then we looked at the napkin and thought that doesn't exist where we are at any rate. So we rang 80 friends in pastoral ministry and said, if we put on something that is just about you and the grace of God, you're not going to learn to put together a child protection policy or exegete Obadiah, would you come? And 80 came. And the very first night, a retired Baptist guy who helped us put it together gave a keynote address on doubt and failure in leadership. And we were incredibly naive about what the consequence of that address would be. It opened the floodgates on our pastoral team and has done ever since.
Doubt and failure were the themes.
Doubt and failure, yeah.
Okay,
So
why do you think they struck such a nerve?
Because it was a place that was safe to say those things. And the lesson that we've learnt now over the years is that very often folk in ministry do not have a place that is safe to talk about their own struggles. Whether that's a denominational structure where the line management structure crosses over with the pastoral structure, so something gets written on your file, so you can't really tell it there. And in an independent local church, you're always worried that if you tell your elders what you're struggling with, that will have employment consequences as well. So you end up being the person who listens to everybody else, but you don't have any access to it yourself. And what we had inadvertently done was create somewhere that had no power and therefore was safe. Yeah. And that's been a real blessing ever since. That's been going 15 years now, and it's going great guns. We're delighted with it.
Amazing. So you have a pastor's heart for pastors and for their pastoral needs, but you've also written this book, Powerful Leaders, into a context in which we've seen how often pastoral leadership can go wrong. Set the scene for what you think is the state of play. You minister in lots of different places, but let's keep it to the UK for now. What is the state of play in the UK evangelical church as you see it?
So I think the UK evangelical church has obviously been rocked by a number of high-profile incidents of leaders falling, either with criminal misconduct or sinful bullying, and it's really exposed a raw underbelly, a nerve. I think that the temptation is for one set of folk to underplay the issues, to say, well, I haven't seen anything like that, therefore it doesn't exist. And for another set of folk, perhaps to overstate the issues and to assume that it's absolutely everywhere and every leader is guilty and complicit. And I want to try to set out in the book a rather more nuanced framework about how to look at these issues. So my view is that very, very few folk go into Christian leadership expecting to become wolves. Mm-hmm. But some do. And some do despite themselves and despite their best intentions. I think that lots and lots don't. But the question that I really want to explore is, how do we get as savvy as possible to the use of our soft power and our influence? Because that's where it goes wrong without us spotting. So while I think that the great majority of evangelical leaders don't go wrong, I think all Christian leaders at least have the potential to go wrong.
Yes.
Because we all have sinful hearts. We are all not particularly savvy to ourselves. We all have a vested interest in looking at ourselves through rosy tinted spectacles. And congregations, generally speaking, don't know where the limits of leaders' authority lie, and leaders are bad at self-limiting.
Right.
So what I want to do is basically just open up the issues and say, let's think this could happen to me. I am not immune from this. And if we think in advance what would protect me and other people from the worst version of me, then we might be in a better position to think healthily about these things. So what does it look like for a church and a leader to be on a journey perpetually towards healthiness?
Right. And one of the things that I think is eye-opening is to consider the ways in which we have power already. I remember hearing Diane Langberg speak at ELF. When would that have been? 2018, 2019? And she spoke about the real issue, especially with pastoral leadership, is that none of the pastors think they have power, and yet they have incredible amounts of this thing called power, and it's a new thought to leaders that they in fact have it, and therefore must steward it in a Christ-like way. And that was news to me. It was like, wow. And I wonder whether that is because it's invisible to us, because it is so much the soft power of family. Church is family, and we're brothers and sisters in Christ, aren't we? And everything is very informal. Not very much is scrutinized. We read books like Brothers, We Are Not Professionals, which is true,
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
We are not professionals, and yet, therefore, that can become a cover for very unprofessional and then unchristian behavior because of the nature of the kinds of power that we have. So can you convince us, Marcus, that in whatever Christian leadership role that we have, we have power, and what kind of power it is that we have?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So we have two kinds of power, I think. We have formal, legitimated. Let's just distinguish terms first. When I say authority, I mean having the right to act. And when I talk about power, I mean having the ability to act. And I believe that we have essentially two kinds. We have formal, legitimated authority, which is the authority given us by the organization that we work for to carry out the responsibilities that we have. And that has the benefit usually, not always, but usually, that it is transparent, it is circumscribed, everybody knows what it is accountable, it's plural, it's in the light. And then we have soft power, which is much, much harder to think about because it is relational, it is exemplary, it is... I've been really struck over the last year with just how much the New Testament talks about leaders being imitable. Now, just imitation gives you a huge amount of power. I want somebody to be able to imitate me. But if they therefore trust me, that means that the temptation is that people will do what I say just because I say it, regardless of whether or not I'm right, and regardless of whether that leads to their maturity or not. We have power by dint of long-term trust and credibility. We have power by dint of the platforms that we have and the fact that people just automatically trust people on platforms, although maybe that's changing at the moment. We have power by dint of are credibility that goes with personality and personableness. Now, nobody wants a non-personable church leader, but it does mean that the people who are attracted into church leadership tend to be very, very good at gaining people's trust. And under normal circumstances, when everything's going well, all of this is highly positive. But the flip side of the positive is that when it's going badly, when family is going well, brilliant, isn't it? When family is going badly, the bad toxic things are nagging as well. Very, very, very toxic. So these things are really important. They're critical. Everybody in ministry knows that after a while, after say 5 years in a ministry, your soft power, all these things that I'm talking about here, dramatically outweighs your formal power. You can get things done by influence that you possibly can't get done formally. And the temptation, therefore, is to use your influence to get things done that you can't get done formally. If I just maneuver that person into that position or maneuver that person out, if I just ring that person before the meeting and say, you are going to support me, aren't you? If there's a dodgy vote coming, or whatever it is, all of a sudden you're able to use your soft power to buy hard power, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
If you have enough of it, it's convertible.
Yeah.
The trouble is this, that you use the soft power, you use your influence, you use your personableness and your credibility in the first instance because you think you're getting a good end for Jesus. You don't use it selfishly. And therefore, it's easy to justify to yourself that I'm doing Jesus's work, maybe not quite Jesus's way, but it's okay because there's a good outcome. And everybody likes the outcome. And when there's a good outcome, nobody questions it. So it's exactly the point that you can also, well, two things happen. Firstly, you can leverage the outcome to get yourself more formal power. And secondly, what you've done is you've established a precedent that you can use your soft power to get something illegitimately and nobody questions it. So all of a sudden, it's become the modus operandi of the church.
This is
now,
the slippery
what
slope.
happens? I have a lot of sympathy. So somebody said to me recently, I've been parachuted into a small church by the bishop. It's going to fail unless I do some radical things. And I have been given all the authority, all the power, and told to do whatever I think is necessary. So how on earth do I not abuse that? And I think that that's a very, I'm really glad the person was asking the question because that means they're less inclined to abuse it. But it's not always that somebody is rubbing their hands in glee saying, I can become an abusive leader. We step into this kind of territory, we cross the boundary almost unwittingly at first.
Right. Which is the sort of the heart of the book is this slippery slope idea that you have, where you begin with legitimate and transparent kind of authority, and it ends. Take us. Obviously, it takes a whole book to kind of unpack that, but where can this sort of stuff end?
So the 5 categories I outlined start with legitimate and legitimated authority that is in the light because it has 4 distinguishable features, namely it is accountable, transparent, plural, and embodied in the church community in the way that it acts. So you can easily see how that operates. In my view, the best churches at this actually signpost their pastoral practice. On your website, for example, it ought to be possible for folk to look at that and say, here's how pastoral practice and leadership in this church operates. Just to give one example, if I go to an elder and share personal stuff, can I have confidence where that information is going to go or not go? That seems to me to be just good, healthy practice. So transparent, plural, accountable, embodied in the church community, in the light. Then we've got our soft power, which I think is very normally exercised in a very godly way, our pastoring, our one-to-ones, our mentoring, our trust, our credibility. And Churches can't actually operate without that, are exemplary on moral authority. The trouble being that it is less accountable and less transparent and very much harder for people to scrutinize if anything goes wrong. The third category is where I think it first goes wrong, which is when you move into what I've already talked about, which is other serving or perceived mission or gospel serving illegitimate use of authority. And by that, I mean doing something that you think gets a kingdom end or a gospel end, but not using gospel means. So ends justify means. And as soon as you do that, it doesn't matter how good the end is. It's not of God. If you've got there using ungodly means that Jesus can't own. Then there's the fourth category. So having got to other serving illegitimate leadership, it's quite easy then, I think, to trip over into self-serving illegitimate leadership. Particularly if somebody picks you up and says, hang on a minute, you did something there that looked like it got gospel ends, but I'm not sure about the means that you got there. The temptation at that point is to self-defend.
Sure.
It's not always self-promotion. You're not going into self-serving mode just because I want power. You might want self-protection. You might want self-protection for all kinds of reasons. You might have a strong cabal in the church that controls the church meeting that hates you. You might be in a denominational situation where there is a move away from orthodoxy and you find yourself regularly lambasted from outside and you just want to protect yourself and your family. You might find that you are in a situation where there are just completely unrealistic demands made upon you, and you want to protect yourself. So you move into self-serving illegitimate leadership. And at this point, all the mechanisms are to do with you keeping your position and not being overwhelmed and yada, yada, yada. And then I think that there is a fifth category, and I refer to it in the book as the most serious abuses of power, which are deliberate and intentionally building yourself up at other people's expense. It is actively setting out to abuse them. I think you can end up in category 4, the self-serving illegitimate leadership, just about without quite realizing that you're doing it, but you can't end up in the fifth one without realizing that you're doing it. Now, in the book, I'm more concerned with the start of that slope than I am at the end. There are other people, you've mentioned Diane Langberg, who are much, much better at talking about criminal sexual abuse, those kinds of issues. I am interested in the first abuses more than I am in the worst abuses.
Yes.
Because I think that everybody stands in danger of those.
What do you think that does? Because as I read your book, I very much appreciated that. And The Slippery Slope is just a brilliant analysis of how you can find yourself becoming the baddies. You know, the great Mitchell and Webb sketch from 2006, where a couple of SS guards, a couple of SS guards come to realize that they are the baddies. And what's funny about the sketch, it's funny because it never happens. You never actually wake up to the Nazi that you are. You know, the self-justification just goes very deep in so many of us. And so it's just such a wake-up call, I think, your book, to have us all to think, what are the first signs rather than the worst signs of abuse? But it sort of reminded me of, I forget which South American dictator it was that I heard. One of his family members said, I always knew he was going to be a dictator because he cheated at Monopoly. And it's sort of as a sort of a first step along the slippery slope. And it's always sort of stuck with me because now whenever I see anybody cheating at Monopoly, I'm sort of hyper vigilant to, you're a hop, skip, and a jump from being a despot. Is there a danger of that making us hyper vigilant to the small things when, like, there are worst case scenarios out there that should be on our radar screens? How do you navigate that?
I don't think we want to ignore either of those things. It's very, very easy to extrapolate from the worst case scenarios and assume that it's everybody. Mm-hmm. But like I said before, I think it is at least everybody in principle. And the monopoly example is quite an interesting one, because what you've demonstrated with the monopoly example is what kind of character you are. Mm. The critical question about character, somebody said to me recently, churches tend to hire on skills and fire on character, which I think is very interesting and very revealing. If you don't hire on character, sooner or later, you might find yourself firing on character. But the trouble is that churches do look for skills. And a couple of very interesting things happen, I think, even as early as ministry interviews. So what happens is that somebody comes along, the church has put out maybe a job description that the Archangel Michael couldn't do. But they think, well, I've got to say that I can do this, otherwise I'll give the job to somebody else. So you present a fantasy picture of yourself right from the word go. And as soon as you got the job, you've got to inhabit it. So the mask comes really, really early. And the longer you go on having to be unflappably smiling and be the one who floats 6 foot above everything and not be human, the bigger the gulf between what you're actually like inside and the facade that you present gets. The very first casualty is that you stop walking in repentance and faith because you can't actually admit to ever getting anything wrong in front of the church. You can no longer be the chief repenter. And if you're not able to be the chief repenter as the leader at the front, then nobody else knows how to do it. So you create this culture of perceived expectation of perfection and superficiality. It's gilded, it's slick. The trouble is that folk look at you and think, well, I've got to emulate that, but I can't. So I put up the facade as well. Yes. And then you just sunk.
Right.
Then you cannot row back until something catastrophic happens. And just watching that movie Deepwater Horizon yesterday. Not seen it before. Great movie. The worst oil rig disaster in history. Okay. But when the spark finally just ignites the oil rig and everything goes up in flames, it's not that there's no backstory. There is a backstory of greed, incompetence, systemic failure that had gone unnoticed, checks that hadn't been carried out, and everybody had just let things slide. Right. I think when you see catastrophic things go on with leaders, it's very, very easy for churches or wider constituencies and tribes to say, oh, it was just a lone bad apple. There's no backstory here. Because then you can just get rid of them and carry on as before without taking a long, hard look at yourself.
Yeah.
I think we're way off your question now, but if I were now to go to a new ministry, if I were to go to pastor a new church, the first thing I would do is this. I would sit down with the church officers, and then I'd sit down with the church, and I would say, look, the person who is most at risk of abusing power here is me because I've got most of it. And it's your responsibility to look after me in this regard by keeping me accountable for the way I do it. My responsibility and accountability is to the church. So if you think I'm going wrong, then my office doors open, and if it's not, then you batter it down and you pin me to the carpet. But when pastors and elders and church wardens and the like are putting together risk assessments, for example, do we put ourselves on it? We should do, because we're the biggest risk factor.
Yeah.
And if all your policies and your risk assessments and your church discipline is applicable to everybody apart from the most senior people,
yes,
they're not worth the paper they're written on.
Right. Is there another issue with the slippery slope in that it is an entirely Christian impulse to think, yes, there are shepherds and there are sheep and there are wolves, and when you look at the wolf, for your first impulse to be there, but for the grace of God go I. I think there's something obviously very, very Christian about that. But there's also the sense of, with a wolf, my first duty is to protect the flock from the wolf. and that actually, yes, it's very much important that I think through how I might become a John Smythe, to put a name out there. I would say it's even more important for us culturally to think about when a wolf like a John Smythe appears, what do we do? Because there's one kind of failure that makes you like a John Smythe. There's another kind of failure where you do not stand up to a John Smythe, and where the institution allows the abuse to happen and flourish hidden or in plain sight or whatever, and that those institutional things are even more urgent in our current crisis. What would you say?
Let's talk both about institutional responses and about individual responses. So if an individual, something's going wrong or a leader's going wrong, I think that they can be in a terrible bind. So firstly, Christians are instinctively hardwired to be forgiving. They're instinctively hardwired to look at our own hearts and to take the plank out of our own eyes first, and to assume, therefore, that we must be reading something wrong.
Yes.
And when somebody is going badly wrong, they have a very strong vested interest in playing to that narrative. No, you've misread, you've misunderstood, you don't have all the facts. It's not what you think it is. Even when you do start to realize it is what you think it is, then you get faced with questions like, well, what's a forgiving response? What is the most what has the most chance of a healthy outcome here? Is it to raise that publicly? Is it to fight it? Is it to what is it that I can do that that has the best chance of positive outcomes and the least chance of leaving a church a smoking ruin? And if you're dealing with these things on your own, and with abusive leaders you almost always are, because they're very good at siloing people, that is a far from easy question to figure out. And many of us who have been whistleblowers know what it's like in our minds to imagine best possible outcomes or best possible rationales for what we see going on, and then sort of reverse engineer in our minds, well, it couldn't possibly be that they're a wolf, could it? So you sort of reason backwards. And then you also come to the conclusion, well, hang on a minute, if they are, and I'm the one who has to call them out, the chances are that I'm the one who gets the most badly damaged here. I might lose my church, I might lose my job, I might lose my reputation and my friends, my family might be disadvantaged. So a very, very strong vested interest in not seeing what's going on right in front of our eyes very often. It's not exactly willful blindness, but unwitting blindness can become.
There's betrayal blindness, isn't there?
It's betrayal blindness. Yeah. That's right. We're very, very reluctant to think about categories of betrayal. It's why people stay in domestic abuse situations much longer than they should.
Yeah.
And then we have to recognize that people who are actively manipulative, I think that there is a difference between the bullying leader, they're coercive, they get you in line like this, and the manipulative leader who just does it with winsome smiles and very careful control behind the scenes. But both of them isolate and divide and rule, and both of them always have willing dupes that they have never done anything bad to, that they can always depend on to provide an alibi. So the whistleblower almost always comes off badly, and they know it before the event, which is why it happens so rarely. And in church circles, they have far fewer protections than you do in most secular circles. And you're more naturally given to forgive. So you tend to put it off and off and off, thinking, well, if I stay and work with this, maybe things get better. When somebody's genuinely a wolf, and wolves come dressed not just as sheep, they come dressed as shepherds as well.
Yeah.
Paul says to the Miletus elders, when I've gone, some from among your own number will arise and distort the truth and try to draw disciples away. Did he know who it was, who he was talking to then? Don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they didn't know. Maybe all of them were standing there thinking, well, not me. The fact that it can happen to Miletus elders that Paul is talking to, and the fact that Judas is there in the 12 tells you that these things are not abnormal, but normal.
Mm-hmm.
And we are probably much better protected against them if we were to go, no, these things can and do happen. There are plenty of scriptural examples. So let's just build that into our normal expectation. Mm-hmm. And maybe we will be better safeguarded. There are no panaceas.
Yeah.
But what about institutions? That, I think, is a really, really interesting question. So churches, I think, at the moment, for fear of allegations of abuse, are, generally speaking, not well thought through on church discipline. But if a church is not thought through on church discipline, you'll never do it when it's the leader that needs it. So having just a general understanding of what healthy leadership looks like in difficult circumstances might better prepare you for when the leadership goes unhealthy. To give one example, in Living Leadership, last year we looked again at all our policies and we strengthened them as much as we possibly could, with the aim that with things like grievance or complaint, all our practice should be in the light. And the weakest person who is ever connected with us should be able to use that against me without cost to them. Because otherwise it's just a piece of paper in a filing cabinet. If the weakest person cannot do that, then it's a pointless exercise.
Right.
So institutions, I think, are protected by policies. But if you haven't got a culture that wants transparency, then, well, culture eats policy for breakfast, doesn't it?
Yeah, right.
The institution that has the biggest difficulty, I think, is what you might describe as a wider culture or tribe. And everybody knows that cultures and tribes are extremely powerful things, but generally speaking, there's nobody within them that is tasked with the question about what tribal healthiness looks like. Tribes don't have safeguarding officers. Denominations do, but tribes tend not to. And therefore, you get emperor's new clothes scenarios and bubbles and echo chambers very easily, where people will stay in the tribe because of the benefit that it provides to them. And they will justify anything that looks slightly odd as an aberration or an eccentricity or a bad apple, because everybody has a quite strong vested interest in not looking too closely at stuff that might be going wrong, lest it causes unintended consequences.
Yes. Your stuff about tribe is absolutely fascinating. You have a very sort of systematic, big picture mind, Marcus, and it's just fascinating to see how these things develop one to the other. And when you speak about how sort of tribes develop, you say a cause is identified, a network develops, the narrative becomes the most influential thing. A vital part of the narrative is that the culture is us. The narrative creates an in-group and an out-group. The price of critiquing the culture grows. Dependency on the culture creates willful blindness, and willful blindness becomes genuine blindness. Just step by step into a pit, really. As you look at the UK culture, UK evangelical church culture, what do you think is the narrative that we tell ourselves about who we are? And as that morphs into a them and us kind of thing, who are we and who are the outsiders? What are the stories that we're telling ourselves?
So I'm not sure that there is what I would describe as a unifying evangelical narrative per se in the UK at the moment. I think different tribes understand the particular call of God on them differently, whether that's a tribe that unifies around a particular concern for gospel preaching and producing preachers, a tribe that unites around understanding themselves as families on a mission, for example. A tribe, we could talk about different kinds of unifying narratives for different tribes. But the thing that concerns me with any tribe is if you're not very careful, you define yourself by what you're not.
Right.
And as soon as you start to define yourself by what you're not, you essentially make yourself immune from external critical friends.
Yeah.
Because we tend to apply self-congratulatory adjectives to ourselves. We say, well, we're the strategic ones, we're the missional ones, we're the ones who go to hard places, we're the ones who are safe pairs of hands, we're the awesome ones. Pick your self-congratulatory adjective of choice. And of course, that means that the people who are not with us are the not strategic ones, the not awesome ones, and therefore, why should we listen to them?
Right. Yeah.
So you get the bubble and echo chamber. And then anybody who critiques from inside and risks the stability of the tribe kind of automatically becomes an outsider by doing so. It's all done with plausible deniability, but everybody knows what it's like to all of a sudden go from being an insider to an outsider if you're given to asking hard questions. Yes. You become incapable of getting those questions listened to just because you've raised them. You're no longer supporting the narrative. But if you have no access to external critical friends either, then there's absolutely nothing to stop the Emperor's New Clothes happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was really grateful to Caleb Woodbridge for an illustration, the CEO of IVP. He said that cultures, to be healthy, should work like cells in the body, which are semi-permeable. Mm-hmm. They let in good stuff from outside whilst keeping out the toxins. That's a good illustration, I think.
Yeah.
Or to use another illustration, the immune system in the body goes wrong if it is underactive and lets in loads of bad stuff from outside, or if it is hyperactive and lets in nothing from outside. So yeah, how cultures get to the point where they have external critical friends and where they are sufficiently self-evaluative, I think is a really, really interesting question. Folk from one particular evangelical tribe that asked me to speak into this recently for them, and I don't know them very well, so I didn't know how much of what I said was going to land. They said, the critical thing that you have said to us is that we are very, very highly relational. And that's a really good thing when it's going well.
Yeah.
And a really, really bad thing when it's going badly.
Right.
And it's when you're going badly that you want the safeguards. We've all got used to safeguarding in the kids and youth work sphere and vulnerable adults. But getting used to safeguarding in the leadership sphere, I think, is something that we're still not very good at. And you don't think you need it when everything's going well. But the whole point of having safeguarding in the kids and vulnerable adult sphere is that you have it prospectively to need. You've got to have it in place before you need it, because you'll never put it in place well when the catastrophe happens.
Yes.
I think exactly the same thing is true of leadership. And these folk were saying we'd had various catastrophes happen precisely because we only do things relationally, and we thought that our relational strength would last us forever and through all kinds of through any kind of catastrophe, and it clearly hadn't.
Right. Yeah. But they were semi-permeable enough to invite you in as an outside pair of eyes and to speak into that situation. So there's great.
But the interesting thing about that was that I had to have enough. I had to have enough friendship with them to get invited in.
Sure.
If we don't have friends outside of our own constituencies, then you're never going to go to your enemies.
Right. So, Marcus, your book is very intentionally about leaders and for leaders and trying to get leaders to be self-critical. But do you have a word also for those who have been harmed by abusive leaders? And at that point, it becomes very hard to trust again, and that trust is very hard to exercise even in Christ himself and certainly in church again. What would you say to those who have been harmed by powerful leaders who've used their power inappropriately?
So the first thing to say to anybody who's watching for whom that is true is, I'm extremely sorry that has happened to you. I do know what that's like from the inside. And betrayal is something that shouldn't even exist in God's good creation. It rips apart the fabric of creation, and it shreds our lives. And you know what it's like from the inside. It is absolutely critical. The first thing that happens is that you get to a place of safety. If you're in that kind of situation at the moment, and particularly if you're on the receiving end of something criminal or sexual, then get out. Go to the police if you need to. Find external friends, possibly external Christian friends, definitely. If you haven't got them in your current situation, go outside. If you think, well, I haven't got any, then consider a call to a safeguarding agency. But get out. Do not stay in an abusive situation. Unless you get out, it is impossible to get to a place where you can make sense of what has been done to you. And sense making is the first thing that you need. Also, you're very, very subjective in the harm that has been done to you. It's very unlikely that you are going to get to a place of sense without counsel and help from others. Intervention of care is basically what you need. And from a place of sense, you may find that you also start to get to a place where healing is possible to start to happen. Folk who then think, actually, injustice has been done to me, and I need justice too. I think you find yourself in some real difficulties. It is quite possible for us to want justice and think, well, if I don't get justice, I cannot heal. But then we only approach issues of justice through the lens of our own turmoil. And those who have harmed us might have a very strong vested interest in making sure you never get justice, sure, because that would mean that they have to admit to stuff that they've done and repent, with all the things that go with exposure for them. So it's quite possible to tie ourselves emotionally to the people who have harmed us in such a way as they have no vested interest in our healing. Matthew 18, I think, is very good that there's a process for these kinds of things. If somebody has harmed you, sinned against you, you go to them. And if you don't get satisfaction from that, you take 2 or 3 with you. If you don't get satisfaction from that, you take it to the church. And if you don't get satisfaction from that, you treat them, it says, like a tax collector or a pagan. So Jesus has a sort of a process there. It's worth thinking, where might I be on that process? But if you find after all of that you're still not in a position where it's possible for you to move on because the person simply won't allow you that, the Bible does introduce a couple of other categories that forgiving type Christians are very reluctant to admit to. One is enemy, that somebody actually is not somebody who wants to be forgiven, who can be reconciled with. They are putting themselves in the category of being my enemy. But Jesus tells us what we do with them. What they get is mercy and forgiveness and prayer. Mercy rather than forgiveness. We pray for them, we do good as there is the opportunity to do so, but forgiveness isn't the category there. The category, in fact, is, this is Romans 12, is you leave vengeance to the Lord. So what we're doing with folk under those circumstances for our healing is not forgiving, it is releasing them from our vengeance, saying, I'm leaving that with my just God. I think it's very common for us to think, unless I forgive that person who is not repentant, then I cannot heal. I kind of think, well, forgiveness is about my heart getting released from a burdensome stone that's on it. Actually, forgiveness is about the other person if they're repentant. If they're not repentant, I think that the category actually for releasing my heart is releasing them from my vengeance to the Lord's perfect justice. is the thing that may start to allow us to move on. But these things, when you have been badly damaged by leaders, are likely to be lifelong. I'd really strongly recommend that you get good counsel. And there is no quick fix called forgiveness that you wave like a magic wand over things that all of a sudden returns everything to sweetness and light. And the more you have been abused in the longer term, then the longer term I expect your recovery and moving on to be.
Right. That is a very realistic word, and there is more in the book for people to grab hold of. Just very quickly, Marcus, but what is your great hope for this book, Powerful Leaders?
My great hope is that it will make leaders and churches, congregations more widely think very hard and be as savvy as possible to the use of soft power and influence.
Yep.
And the result of that will be that we're all on a journey towards greater spiritual healthiness. What we want is spiritually healthy leaders for spiritually healthy churches. What I don't want is for people to be so suspicious of leadership that nobody wants to lead anymore.
Right. And we'd love to have you back on again, Marcus, to talk about how culturally we address this situation and move forwards positively in the grace of Christ. But Marcus Honeysett, is there some place that people can catch up with you best online?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Marcus Honeysett. Possibly, Glenn, we could put in the description, the links with this video. There is an IVP downloadable resource that gives a summary of the book with, it's a multi-page resource that gives the 5 categories that I've listed, and will show anybody what we flesh out in the book. You might like to have a little look at that and then see if you want to go and get the book. It looks like this, bright red cover, Powerful Leaders.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
That would be awesome. And yes, I do endorse the book and have very positively reviewed it. So go out and get a copy of Powerful Leaders. Marcus Honeysett, thanks for joining us.
It's lovely to have to be here. Thanks, Glenn.